So thank you again for joining our Cash for College Advanced FAFSA webinar today. This webinar is going to build on our FAFSA 101 webinar. So we hope you had a chance to join us for that last month. But we're going to address some of the more complex parts of the financial aid application today. As always, we would like to recognize and thank our sponsors and our partners for supporting this work. They make this training possible, so we really couldn't do this work without them. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. Please keep your microphones on mute at all times to avoid any feedback during the presentation. This webinar will be recorded and posted to youtube.com/alabamapossible. And throughout the webinar, please feel free to submit questions by utilizing the Zoom chat feature. We encourage you to share your commitment to building a college-going culture on social media. You can find us on all of these different platforms at AL Goes to College. That's the number 2, at AL Goes to College. And then, of course, feel free to use any of the hashtags listed below so that we can see all of the great work y'all are doing and share it with others. We especially encourage you to use hashtag PellYes, hashtag FAFSA, and hashtag Cash for College when posting about financial aid topics. Just a quick reminder, if you haven't already, high schools can sign up for the Alabama Goes to College campaign at alabamapossible.org/register 2021-22. And if you're unsure whether your school has registered, please feel free to send the name of your school in a message to Keela Lawrence, and she will check the status of your registration. We do only need one representative from each school to complete the form, so please just check really quickly to see if your school has already registered before doing so. Okay, so I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Alabama Goes to College campaign, but basically our goal is for every student in the state to have the opportunity to plan for, pursue, and complete valuable post-secondary credentials. And there are 3 components to our campaign. Today, we're going to focus on Cash for College. It builds awareness around financial aid for post-secondary education. And our goal with the initiative is for every graduating senior to complete their free application for federal student aid before they graduate from high school. This will, of course, give them the opportunity to access any federal, state, or institutional aid that they're eligible for. We know October has been an incredibly busy month, especially considering that last week was Alabama College Application Week. So we know that you've been juggling a lot of different tasks, but we hope you've had a successful month promoting FAFSA completion with your students. All right, so today we're going to quickly review the steps of the FAFSA. We're going to describe eligibility for federal financial aid. We'll investigate complicated dependency circumstances. We'll determine parental information to report in complex living situations. We'll explore a few other special circumstances, and then we will review FAFSA completion resources. Please remember, we are more than happy to accept your questions throughout the training, and you can type those in the chat. We'll address them towards the end of today's webinar. So we wanted to start off with a poll question to see if the folks in attendance today were able to join us for our FAFSA 101 webinar. And if you weren't able to join, we hope you had a chance to view the recording of the webinar on our YouTube channel. So we'll just see who all is in the Zoom room with us today and whether y'all have been with us last month too. Awesome, thank y'all for answering that poll question. Like I mentioned, here is a link to the recording of that webinar. We'll send out a copy of the presentation slides in a follow-up email shortly after this session, and in that you'll be able to access all of the links you see here. So let's start with a quick review of some of the basics. The FAFSA, of course, is the free application for federal student aid. It gives students access to the largest source of financial aid for certificates or degrees, whether at 2-year or 4-year programs. And the application is used to determine a student's eligibility for grants, scholarships, work-study jobs, and loans. So let's look at the 8 steps needed to complete the form. And I'm going to highlight some of the steps that we're really planning to focus on during today's session. So we're starting out with step 1, create a username and password. This is called an FSA ID. And if you are a dependent student for the purposes of the FAFSA, your parent will also need to create a username and password known as the FSA ID. Step 2 is to begin the FAFSA form and create a save key. That save key will allow you to save your FAFSA form and access it later if needed. Step 3 is to complete the student demographics section, including entering your name and birth date. And so for students who aren't high school seniors and who are returning to the FAFSA because they've completed it before, this information is going to auto-populate for them. Remember, students have to complete a FAFSA every year for which they are in college. Step 4, list the schools you want your FAFSA information sent to. Even if you haven't applied or been accepted yet, make sure you include all the schools you're even considering. Step 5, answer the series of questions to determine your dependency status. The dependency guidelines are set by Congress and are different from those used by the Internal Revenue Service. So we're going to talk about this in detail today, but dependency is a really tricky topic, and folks often think that if a student is dependent for the purpose of federal income taxes, that they're also a dependent for the FAFSA, and that is just not the case. They're 2 totally separate guidelines, so we'll review that in detail. Step 6, if you are determined to be a dependent student, then you'll need to complete the parent demographics section. This is something we'll also go over in great detail today. Step 7, provide your and your parents' financial information. You will use your 2020 tax return for the 2022-23 FAFSA form. And a tip and a high recommendation, use the data retrieval tool to help make this a much easier process. We'll review that in detail too. And then lastly, we have step 8, sign your form. If you're a dependent student, you'll need to have your parents sign the form as well. And then once it's signed, you will submit the FAFSA. So again, those 3 steps that we have a star by, we'll be going over those in great detail today. Let's briefly talk about eligibility requirements. Who is eligible for federal financial aid? To be fully eligible to accept federal aid, students must have a high school diploma or GED certificate, or complete an approved homeschool education, or meet one of the ability to benefit alternatives. They must also be a US citizen or eligible non-citizen, and they must have a valid Social Security number, with the exception of students from the Republic of the Marshall Islands, Federated States of Micronesia, and the Republic of Palau. Now, they also must be enrolled or accepted as a regular student in an eligible degree or certificate program. They must maintain satisfactory academic progress in college. And then they must sign certifying statements on the FAFSA. And these are mostly applicable to current college students who have already been receiving federal aid. So those certifying statements are that the student is not in default on a federal student loan, they do not owe money on a federal student grant, and then they will not use federal student aid for any other purposes than educational purposes. So those are the eligibility requirements for students to qualify for federal financial aid. Now, who needs an FSA ID? Remember, we said the FSA ID is a username and password. It allows students and parents to access federal student aid web pages. It's also going to serve as an electronic signature when the student submits their FAFSA. A student needs to create an FSA ID by listing their full name and their social security number exactly as it is seen on their social security card. This is very important for matching the student to the Social Security Administration. Now, a parent should also create an FSA ID if the student is a dependent under federal guidelines. And here we mean federal guidelines for the FAFSA, not for federal income taxes. So a parent should create an FSA ID when their student is a dependent. And you need a social security number in order to create an FSA ID. So if the parent does not have a social security number, they're not going to be able to create an FSA ID, but don't worry, they'll still be able to complete the FAFSA. Instead of signing electronically, they're going to print and sign and submit the signature page by mail. And we're going to talk about this in more detail a little bit later on. But one tip I just wanted to remind y'all of, we encourage students and families to use a personal email account when they're creating their FSA ID. You want to use a personal email account that's not subject to change, like a school email account would be or a work email account would be. All right, so we're going to go through the application section by section to discuss some of the trickier or more confusing questions. So as you can see in the screenshot here, we have each section listed at the top, and we're just going to move through one by one. Starting off with student demographics. In the student demographics section, it will ask about a student's citizenship status, and the student can respond one of three ways. They can answer, yes, I am a US citizen or US national. No, but I am an eligible non-citizen. Or no, I am not a citizen or eligible non-citizen. And so depending on which option the student selects, their process for moving forward will differ. So if option 1 applies and the student is a US citizen or US national, they will just proceed forward with the application. If option 2 applies and the student is an eligible non-citizen, then they will need to provide their alien registration number. If option 3 applies and the student is not a citizen or eligible non-citizen, then they will proceed forward with limited aid options, and they will need to contact the financial aid office of each college they might attend after submitting the FAFSA. So let's dive into each of these options a little bit deeper. For option 1, US citizens are persons, except for the children of foreign diplomatic staff, who are born in the 50 states, the District of Columbia, and in most cases, Puerto Rico, the US Virgin Islands, Guam, and the Northern Mariana Islands. US citizens also include most persons born abroad to parents or a parent who are US citizens. And then US nationals are natives of American Samoa or Swains Island. Now let's look at option 2. Now, if a student is not a US citizen or US national, they might be what's called an eligible non-citizen if they can provide documentation such as the following. So a green card for a permanent resident, an arrival departure record for a refugee, asylee, or a parolee. If they have documentation of a T visa or a parent who has a T visa, so this applies to victims of human trafficking. If they have battered immigrant status, so they are victims of abuse, or if they have citizenship of the Federated States of Micronesia, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, or the Republic of Palau. So these are eligible non-citizens. As you can see in the screenshot, eligible non-citizens will be prompted to enter their 8 or 9-digit alien registration number. Okay, so let's look at option 3. A student is not a citizen or eligible non-citizen, and therefore will not be eligible for federal student aid if they have any of the following. So if they have been granted deferred action for childhood arrivals or DACA, and real quick, just to refresh everyone, DACA is an immigration policy that allows some individuals who are brought to this country as children to receive a renewable 2-year period of deferred action from deportation and become eligible for a work permit in the US. So if they've been granted DACA, if they have a F1 or F2 student visa, a J1 or J2 exchange visitor visa, a G series visa pertaining to international organizations. So a student who falls into any of these categories will not be eligible for federal student aid. And I want to emphasize federal here. So they are not considered a citizen or eligible non-citizen. But some DACA recipients do have a social security number. So they might be able to complete the FAFSA to determine their eligibility for state or institutional aid. So while they may not be eligible for federal grants and loans, they could still complete the FAFSA so that an institution can use that information to determine their eligibility for state or institutional aid. So some DACA recipients do have that social security number. And we want to note the current administration has proposed expanding federal aid eligibility to DACA recipients. We will keep you updated on the progress of that. And I just want to emphasize here that we're going to cover this topic in much more detail next month during our other webinar that's called Navigating Financial Aid for Immigrant Families. So please stay tuned for that opportunity. All right, so we discussed the citizenship question that's under student demographics. But now we're moving on to another question. I want to point out one of these questions that might seem straightforward, but could cause some issues for students. So when the FAFSA asks, what college degree or certificate will you be working on when you begin the 2022-23 school year? Students should select the option that best describes their educational goals. So for high school seniors who are undecided between a 2-year or 4-year program, or undecided between a technical certificate or an academic degree, they should choose one here, choose one of the options here, and they should not select other or undecided. By selecting other or undecided, they might have to do more follow-up work with the financial aid office. So it's best to put their best idea of whatever they'll be pursuing. Then when it asks what the student's college grade level will be when they begin the 2022-23 school year, if the student is a high school senior, so they're in high school at this very moment, they're going to answer this question saying that they've never attended college, so they're a first year. And even if they took things like dual enrollment or AP classes, and maybe they have some college credits to their name, they're still going to answer this question, never attended college / first year. All right, and then the last question on this page that we want to highlight, it asks if the student is interested in being considered for work study. And we highly encourage students to select yes, just to be considered for work study opportunities. It is not committing them to a work study job. It's merely putting them in a pool of students who may have this opportunity if their college or university participates in something like the federal work study program. So it's always best to have the opportunity available and select yes here. So those are the trickier parts of the student demographics section. So now we're going to move on to school selection. The student will be prompted to enter their high school information. And so they have an opportunity to search for their high school by state, city, and name. And if their high school cannot be found in the search, it's important that the student then manually types the city and the full name of their high school so that the FAFSA completion can be tracked at that school. And I'll say it's pretty unusual for a school to not be found through the search, but it does occasionally happen. And so we just want to make sure that the student is entering in the full name of their high school so that it's matched, their FAFSA completion is matched to their high school, and educators like y'all can then track your FAFSA completion rates. So we just wanted to note that in case a student is unable to find the high school through the search. Okay, so we're moving on to dependency status. So the application will walk the student through a series of questions to determine if the student is dependent or independent. And it will even skip questions that aren't relevant to the student. Remember that independent students do not require parent information on the FAFSA, but they may be required to submit additional documentation just to verify their independent status. And that's just because being independent is a little bit less common than being dependent. So independent students do not require parent information. Dependent students must provide parent information on the FAFSA. So if you would like to review all of the dependency questions at once to determine whether or not a student should report parental information, then you can find this printable questionnaire in our educators toolkit. We have both English and Spanish versions available. So we'll really quickly go through each of these questions together. First question, were you born before January 1st, 1999? As of today, are you married? At the beginning of the 2022-23 school year, will you be working on a master's degree or doctorate degree? Do you now have, or will you have, children who will receive more than half of their support from you between July 1st, 2022 and June 30th, 2023? Do you have dependents other than your children or spouse who live with you and who receive more than half of their support from you now and through June 30th, 2023? Are you currently serving on active duty in the U.S. Armed Forces for purposes other than training? Are you a veteran of the U.S. Armed Forces? At any time since you turned age 13, were both your parents deceased? Were you in foster care? Or were you a dependent or ward of the court? Has it been decided by a court in your state of legal residence that you are an emancipated minor, or that someone other than your parent or step-parent has legal guardianship of you? At any time on or after July 1st, 2021, were you determined to be an unaccompanied youth who is homeless or were self-supporting and at risk of being homeless, as determined by the following entities. All right, I know that was a lot, so we're going to kind of digest this a little bit. But after we've read through all of the questions, if the student answers yes to any of the questions, it can just be one of the questions, they are considered independent and do not have to provide parent info. If the student answers no to all of the questions, they are considered dependent and do have to provide parent info. So if you answer yes to just one or maybe multiple, you are independent. If you answer no to all, you are dependent. And there are a couple that I just want to revisit and provide some notes. So when the FAFSA asks whether someone other than a parent or step-parent has legal guardianship of you, this is not the same as legal custody. The court documentations should say legal guardianship. If a student answers yes to this question, they will be considered independent for the purposes of the FAFSA. So they will not have to provide parent information. And then I also want to highlight the question about homelessness. So note here on the screen, the FAFSA first asks, on or after July 1st, 2021, were you homeless or were you self-supporting and at risk of being homeless? So if you answer yes to that question, you're going to be presented with a more detailed question. So now the FAFSA asks, at any time on or after July 1st, 2021, did you receive a determination from any of the entities listed below that you were an unaccompanied youth who was homeless or were self-supporting and at risk of being homeless? So now it's asking if the student is both unaccompanied and homeless. And we're going to define both of those terms on the next slide. But note here that it is saying the student will need a record of determination from one of the entities listed below. So high school or school district homeless liaison, director of an emergency shelter or transitional housing program, director of a runaway or homeless youth basic center or transitional living program. And so defining those terms for you, homeless means lacking fixed, regular, and adequate housing. You may be homeless if you're living in shelters, parks, motels, hotels, public spaces, camping grounds, cars, abandoned buildings, or you're temporarily living with other people because you have nowhere else to go. Also, if you're living in any of these situations and fleeing an abusive parent, you may be considered homeless, even if your parent would otherwise provide a place to live. And then we have the definition for unaccompanied. This means you're not living in the physical custody of your parent or guardian. So the FAFSA is asking if both of these definitions apply to the student, and also if the student has a record of determination from one of those entities that we saw on the previous slide. I'll say if you are working with homeless youth, there are some great resources available. They're linked in the slides. We highly recommend Schoolhouse Connection for learning more about this. Okay, so we have looked at student demographics and dependency status. And we know that if a student is a dependent for the purposes of the FAFSA, they will need to provide parent information. So you can see here that the FAFSA provides all of these different scenarios that could apply to a dependent student. And then it will guide the student on how to proceed based on their specific scenario. So whether their parents live together, married or unmarried, whether their parents are divorced or separated, it's going to give all these different scenarios. But another way of determining whose information to provide is by using this flow chart. So in our educator's toolkit, you'll find a resource that's called Who's My Parent Flowchart. And it's going to guide you through these questions in sequence to determine whose information a student needs to put on their FAFSA. This resource is also available in both English and Spanish. So let's just go through it together. You see right here, it says, dependent students are required to report parent information on the FAFSA. For reporting purposes, parent means your legal, so biological or adoptive, parent or step parent, or a person that the state has determined to be your legal parent. So we're going to go through these questions. First, are your parents married to each other? If yes, report information for both parents on the FAFSA. If no, it's going to ask, do your parents live together? If they do, report information for both of them on the FAFSA, even if they were never married, are divorced, or are separated. If they don't live together, then the FAFSA will ask, did you live with one parent more than the other over the past 12 months? If you did live with one parent more, then you're going to report that parent's information on the FAFSA. And then if they got remarried, you're also going to report the information of your step parent. But let's say you lived with parents 50-50 throughout the year. In that case, you're going to report the information of the parent who provided more financial support over the past 12 months or in the last year that you received support. And then if that parent has remarried, again, you'll report information for your step parent. So we always recommend going through this flowchart in sequence. It notes down here, the following people are not your parents unless they have legally adopted you. So a widowed step parent, your grandparents, foster parents, legal guardians, older brothers or sisters, and aunts or uncles. So a parent is a biological or adoptive parent. The following are not your parent unless they've legally adopted you. Okay, so we've gone through all those questions, and now we want to ask things like, what if a dependent student doesn't live with or doesn't have contact with their parents? So they're dependent and have to provide parent information, but they don't live with their parent or they can't contact their parent. So they can submit the FAFSA without parent information if any of the following applies. Their parents are incarcerated, they have left home due to an abusive family environment, they do not know where their parents are or are unable to contact them, and they've not yet been adopted, or they are older than 21 but not yet 24, are unaccompanied, and are either homeless or self-supporting and at risk of being homeless. So in those very special circumstances, a dependent student can submit their FAFSA without parent information. Now, what they're going to want to do after submitting their FAFSA, they need to know their application will not be fully processed until they take the following actions. They need to immediately contact the financial aid office. They need to gather any required evidence or documentation of their situation. And only then will they receive an EFC and financial aid package based on the determination of the school. So they'll definitely need to follow up with any college or institution they might attend after they submit their FAFSA without the parent information. So that covers some special circumstances, but what about other circumstances that you might encounter with your students? For instance, what if the student does have contact with their parent, but the parent refuses to provide their financial information? In this instance, the student may submit the FAFSA form without parent information, However, they won't be eligible for federal student aid other than an unsubsidized loan. And even that isn't guaranteed. The decision is ultimately going to be up to the financial aid office at the school that they plan to attend, which is why it's so important for the student to follow up with the financial aid office of the school where they might enroll to explain their circumstances. We always recommend reaching out and just giving the details of the student's situation if they feel comfortable. So another circumstance you might encounter is a student who has parents who are undocumented and don't have a social security number. So remember, parental citizenship status does not affect a student's eligibility for federal student aid. It's only asking about a student's citizenship status and not a parent's citizenship status. So for this parent who doesn't have a social security number, you'll enter all zeros when the FAFSA asks for the social security number of the parent. You do not use an individual taxpayer identification number or ITIN if the parent has one. So just to give a brief explanation of the ITIN, the IRS will issue ITINs to help individuals comply with US tax laws. So they just provide a way for the IRS to efficiently process and account for tax returns for those who aren't eligible for social security numbers. And these ITINs are issued regardless of immigration status. So undocumented parents might have one. And you do not want to enter in the ITIN in the space for the social security number. So because the parent might not have a social security number and therefore will not be able to create an FSA ID, they won't be able to sign the FAFSA electronically. So they're instead going to print, sign, and mail the signature page in order to sign the FAFSA. So here you can see a screenshot of an undocumented parent who put all zeros in the space for social security number. All right, I know we've covered a lot here, so I'm just going to recap. These are some steps that will help your students fill out their FAFSA accurately. So to determine whose information to report on the FAFSA, first, we're going to determine whether a student is dependent or independent. Only then will we move forward. If the student is a dependent, then we need to determine who is considered the student's parent for FAFSA purposes. And of course, as we're doing that, we're going to consider any special circumstances that a student might have. You can use both of the resources we linked and provided in our educators toolkit. So that'll be the dependency questionnaire and the Who's My Parent flowchart. But just know that if you don't use those resources, although we do recommend using them, the application will lead the student through these questions step by step. So we're going to do a couple quick scenarios. Here's scenario 1. Tobin's parents are separated. She lives with her mother during the weekdays and her father on the weekends. Tobin's father claimed her on his 2020 taxes. Tobin is considered a dependent for the purposes of the FAFSA. Whose information should she report on the FAFSA? So I'm going to give you a few minutes to think through that before we talk about the answer. All right, Tobin should report her mother's information on the FAFSA since she lives with her mother more than her father over the past 12 months. It does not matter at all that Tobin's father claimed her on his 2020 tax return. Tax dependency is not the same as FAFSA dependency. So we're never going to worry about who claimed who on whose taxes. If Tobin's mother ever were to get remarried, So say that they get officially divorced and then Tobin's mom gets remarried to someone else. Then Tobin should also report her step parents' information on the FAFSA. So just to see how we moved through the flow chart to answer this question, when asked if the parents are married, we answered no because they're separated. The parents don't live together. And so when we get to the question about did you live with one parent more than the other over the past 12 months, we know Tobin lives with the mother more because Tobin spends 5 days a week at her mother's, 2 days a week at her father's. So we'll choose the mother there and we'll report the mother's information on the FAFSA. Okay, scenario 2. Risha hasn't lived with her parents since 2015. She lives with her grandmother, who is her legal guardian and has not adopted her. Whose information should Risha report on the FAFSA? Okay, I'm going to give you a few minutes to think through that on your own, and then we'll talk about the answer together. All right, so Risha doesn't have to report anyone's information but her own. That's because Risha is considered independent for the purposes of the FAFSA. And that's because she can answer yes to the question about legal guardianship. And I'm going to show you all this so that it makes more sense. When we're going through the dependency questions, we see that it asks us, has it been decided by a court in your state of legal residence that you are either an emancipated minor or that someone other than your parent or step-parent has legal guardianship of you? Risha answers yes to this question. Her grandmother is her legal guardian. When you answer yes to just one of these dependency questions, you are considered independent. So in that case, Risha does not need to report anyone's information on her FAFSA other than her own information. And then I'll just point out here again, the following people are not your parents unless they've legally adopted you. So grandparents aren't considered parents unless they've legally adopted the student, and Risha's grandparent has not adopted her. Okay, so we are moving from dependency to student and parent financials. For a dependent student, they will need to provide the financial information of their parent or parents. And their parent can use the IRS data retrieval tool in order to import tax information directly from the IRS. So if they're able to use this, we definitely encourage them to do so because it's going to save time, it's going to save a lot of effort, and it will also potentially save you from having to provide additional information to the college later on. Basically, what the IRS data retrieval tool does, it allows users to securely and accurately transfer tax return information to the FAFSA so that you don't have to do so manually. And in order to do this, you have to enter the correct home address information exactly as it is seen on the tax return. That's in order to match the information with the IRS. So in an ideal scenario, the student or their family has the tax returns printed out in front of them. They're looking at the address line. They're typing in the address line exactly as it is seen in order for the IRS to match it and then pull through all that tax information into the FAFSA. And if the IRS DRT is used to transfer the tax information from the IRS, the information won't actually display on the FAFSA form. So for the user's protection, the answer to each question is replaced with transferred from the IRS. So you know that the tool did its job. You don't have to input the numbers manually yourself. They'll just already be there hidden. Unfortunately, not everyone can use the data retrieval tool. So the following people are ineligible and will therefore need to enter their tax return information manually. So students or parents who are married and filed as married filing separately, students or parents who are married and filed as head of household, students or parents who filed a Puerto Rican foreign tax return, amended return Form 1040X, or a Form 1040NR. So these folks will not be able to use the data retrieval tool and will need to input their tax information manually. So a question that might be raised, what if the marital status of the parents has changed after the tax year? So the parent might have had a change in their marital status after the tax year that's being referenced on the FAFSA. So for the 2022-23 FAFSA, we are referencing 2020 taxes. And say the parent got married in 2021. In this case, their marital status might not reflect the filing status that's actually reflected on their tax return. So here's how we address it. If your parents filed a joint tax return for 2020, but they are no longer married when you're completing the FAFSA, you'll need to subtract the tax return information for your parent's former spouse in order to correctly answer all of the FAFSA questions. And you're only going to answer those questions about the parent whose information you need to provide on the FAFSA. So after we've gone through that flow chart and determined which parent is considered our parent, then we're only going to report their information by subtracting out the former spouse. If your parent didn't file a joint tax return for 2020, but is now married as you're filling out the FAFSA form, you're going to need to add the 2020 tax return information for your parent's current or new spouse. That's for you to be able to correctly answer those FAFSA questions. So just know that if marital changes happened after the tax return year that's being looked at, so in this case, 2020, you're going to need to do some addition or subtraction to accurately reflect the financial information. Another thing related to reporting financial information. What if the financial situation of the student and their family changed significantly because of financial hardships or unemployment related to COVID? In this case, the student and their family will submit their 2020 tax information. Again, it might not reflect their current financial status. After they submit that information, the student should communicate to the financial aid office at the school and before they receive any kind of award package from the school. So you probably heard a theme here. We're frequently recommending that students reach out to the financial aid office of the school that they might attend. And they explain their situation in detail so that the school makes note of that and makes any adjustments that they're able to better serve the student. So let's say a student does that. They talk to the financial aid office of the school where they want to enroll, but then they get their financial aid award and they're still saying, hey, that does not reflect my financial need. What you can do in this situation is appeal directly to the college with some documents. Colleges have an opportunity to use what's called professional judgment to adjust the information that's on the FAFSA. So this could impact a student's EFC and their grant eligibility. And there are some appeal templates available. They're found at Swift Student. They're really great. They guide students on how to make this appeal. And then the college, of course, will ask for specific documents to support what the student is telling them. So just know that that is an option. So we're getting to the very last portion of the application, which is where we sign and submit. For dependent students, both the student and the parent will need to sign the FAFSA. You can see that here. There's two different places for the signature. Signing electronically with an FSA ID is the fastest way for a FAFSA to be processed. For independent students, only the student will need to sign, and ideally they're doing it electronically with their FSA ID. For dependent students, both the student and the parent should sign, ideally electronically with their FSA ID, But if a parent doesn't have a social security number and therefore cannot create an FSA ID, again, they can use the signature page, print it, sign it, and mail it in for the student to be able to submit the FAFSA. And here's what it looks like when you're selecting other options than the electronic signature option. Here we see the option to print the signature page. All right, so we have moved through some of the trickier aspects of the FAFSA, and we want to really quickly end our day today by looking at some FAFSA completion resources. An incredible tool is the FAFSA demo system. This is going to allow you to practice FAFSA scenarios or lead a live demonstration for your students and families. It's basically just a demonstration version of the 2022-23 FAFSA. It offers almost all of the features of the FAFSA, but the only difference being it's not going to process any of the data that you input. That being said, we still encourage you not to use any private or sensitive information when doing a demo, just because this is a system that can be accessed by the public. You don't want to input any sensitive information here. So it's an incredible tool. We highly recommend using it. It'll make you feel a lot more comfortable with the application. All right, let's talk about our dashboards. In terms of setting goals for FAFSA completion and then monitoring your progress on those goals, we have a couple different dashboards, one being our Cash for College data dashboard. It can be found at alabamapossible.org/dashboard. We update it every single weekend throughout the FAFSA cycle, so mainly from October through June. It is currently showing completion data as of October 15th, 2021. It is how you're going to look at school-wide data. So here we see data reflected for Winston County High School. We're seeing that they have 13 FAFSAs completed out of their enrollment of 64 for a completion percentage of 20.3. Then we have this handy pie chart that is showing the number of FAFSAs submitted, completed, and missing. And just a note for public schools, we are using last year's enrollment numbers. We do not update with new enrollment numbers until the State Department of Education has released those. That usually happens around November. As soon as we get the new senior enrollment numbers, we will update the dashboard as soon as possible. So again, this is a great way to track your school-wide FAFSA completion. We also have the AIC student lookup portal that's provided by the Alabama Commission on Higher Education. This is where you're going to track student level FAFSA completion. So you can see each individual student and where they are in the process. You do need a login to be able to access this information. So we plan on talking about this in a lot more detail in a webinar next month. It will be titled Using Data to Support Your FAFSA Completion Campaign. And we will provide a registration link in our newsletter and on our events page. So be on the lookout for that. We'll talk a lot more about how to utilize these dashboards. And AIC hasn't yet updated this one for the current FAFSA cycle, but they plan on doing so in early November. All right, last before we get to our questions, these are some resources for educators. Of course, we recommend the Office of Federal Student Aid. You can call their hotline that's listed here. You can also access their financial aid toolkit. We have our own toolkit available in the Educators Toolkit and the Cash for College subfolder. And then we also recommend the National College Attainment Network's FAFSA resource library too. Your local financial aid offices are incredible partners in this work. They are really able to guide students with things like the verification process, the appeals process. So we definitely recommend partnering with them throughout the school year. As always, you are more than welcome to call us at Alabama Possible at 334-316-6155, or email us at algoestocollege@alabamapossible.org. Your students can also contact us through our help desk. It's the same number that I just read off to you, and they can also reach us on social media platforms at AL Goes to College. So they're welcome to ask us questions about college planning, admissions, and of course, financial aid. And then don't forget to check out our step-by-step FAFSA walkthrough video. So we created this specifically for Alabama students. And in this video, you'll find timestamps for each aspect of the FAFSA. So you can easily watch individual sections or the entire video, whatever you prefer. And this walkthrough is best used by a current high school senior who is considered a dependent student. So that will apply to a lot of your students. We recommend checking it out. But now I want to open it up for questions we received.
All right, so I have a couple questions lined up. So two of them kind of go hand in hand. One, is there a way for us to see which students have completed the FAFSA? And so we know that they can through the AIC portal. So the next question is, how are they able to get a login to the AIC portal?
Yes, for districts that already have signed a user agreement with AIC, they have what are called local access managers. And so those are just designated people who can create accounts for educators. So counselors, career coaches, teachers. If a district has already signed a user agreement, I can look up who the local access manager is, and I can provide you that information, connect you to that person so that they can create an account for you. So what I'm going to do is type my email in the chat so that you can send me an email saying you'd like access, and we'll make sure to get you access to that if your district's already signed an agreement. And yes, Keela is right. That portal isn't updated yet, but as soon as it is updated, you'll be able to see student level data.
So I went ahead and put your email in the chat.
Oh, perfect. Thank you.
All right. And so the last question that I have, since I combined those last two, is what are the options for students when parents do not file or do not plan and will not file their taxes?
Yes, when it asks about parent financial information and specifically tax return information, there will be three options that you can respond with. You can say, I've already completed my tax returns. So the parent has already done 2020 taxes, or I will be filing 2020 taxes. So if the parent has the intention of filing but hasn't done it yet, or I'm not going to file. So those are three different options. Based on the response you give, the application will kind of guide you how to proceed forward. But if the parent selects that I will file, essentially what they're going to do is they're going to estimate what their tax return information would have looked like, and then they're going to correct it after they actually file. Hope that answers your question, but let me know if you have something more specific.
Is there a checklist of everything that students and parents need to have done or in hand when they show up for help with the FAFSA?
Yes, there is. So there is a great webpage on FAFSA.gov that goes through all of the potential documents that might be referenced. So we can include that in the follow-up email that goes out to all of our webinar registrants.
I use that. I use that very, very often. So I actually have it pulled up, and we can also put that in our Google Drive, in our Cash for College Google Drive. And we also have our guidebook, our student and families guidebook, that will take them through the necessary steps for FAFSA, applying to college, and then also looking for scholarships. You all can stay connected with us. We post on our website at Alabama Goes to College. We just put our Alabama College Application Week recap. We saw so many great things happening there, so you can stay connected with us through our website, as well as the phone number. May mentioned it earlier. That's our help desk number. It's 334-316-6155. So that number is for you. the educators as well as your students or anyone who needs help on the journey to college. And then you can also reach us at our email, algoestocollege@alabamapossible.org. So we are here to support you and you're here to support your students. We're all here for Alabama going to college. You all have a great day and thank you so much for your time.